Hello, my name is Jacko Zwetsloot, Senior Advisor to the Australian Chamber of Commerce in Korea. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the Korean media landscape. In this session, we aim to provide a comprehensive overview of South Korea's news media landscape, a dynamic and influential sector that plays a pivotal role in shaping domestic public opinion. This webinar was prompted when one of our member companies, hopefully someone who is online watching us right now, asked about what is normal in engaging with Korean news media in terms of asking for advertising or money in exchange for favourable coverage. We're honoured to have with us today two distinguished experts from the Korean public relations company Insight Communications Consultants. Insight Communications Consultants is a Seoul-based public relations and strategic communications consultancy that helps its clients navigate Korea's media, business, and cultural landscape. They specialize in corporate communications, crisis management, and in media training for both Korean and international organizations. To my immediate left is Mike Breen, the founder and CEO of Insight. He brings over 30 years of experience in Korea as a journalist, author, and communications consultant. He's also author of a fantastic book called The New Koreans that I can wholeheartedly recommend to all of you. To my far left is Sue Kim, who is Insight's Executive Vice President with 3 decades of experience in public relations and investor relations, including significant roles within the LG Group. Full disclosure, I've known both Mike and Sue for over 10 years, and I also worked for them here at Insight Communications for 4 years before joining the Australian Chamber of Commerce in Korea. Together, Mike and Sue will share their experiences on navigating the complexities of Korean media, offering practical insights for businesses and individuals looking to engage effectively. After their presentation, we'll take some questions from you, the online audience. Please write your questions into the Q&A box at any time. I will come back onto the screen and moderate the questions and read them out. That's enough from me. I'm going to go back to the share screen and let Mike and Sue take it away.
You may have asked yourself the question, why should we bother to deal with reporters? Well, the traditional answer, which still stands, is that we need to do so in order to communicate our messages as a company or organization to the audiences that we want to reach via the media. And in order to do that, companies in particular try and control that interaction as much as they can. So they send out news releases when they've got something to announce. They might do interviews when they want to go deeper. And on big occasions, they might have press conferences. They might contribute opinion columns to newspapers. They stage events for the publicity value. They engage in ESG projects for not entirely, but partly for the publicity benefit. And then nowadays, of course, they use social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, X, YouTube, and TikTok to spread their positions on issues and their announcements and so on. And they might minimize their actual dealing with reporters by having their own newsrooms on their websites. So some of you will be very familiar with this, but not everybody does it. Not everybody needs to do it. So overseas now, many companies, I mentioned a second ago, they use their newsrooms on their websites, and they don't actually bother too much with the reporters. And then you have companies which see absolutely no upside and plenty of downside in any kind of media engagement. Take private equity funds, for example, or tech firms where the customers are B2B and the customers know them well. So media is not necessary in these cases for them to establish their reputation, to market their products and services. So I think those of you, well, I'm assuming a lot of you are Australian, you'll be familiar with this need to avoid media, but does it apply same way in Korea? Not exactly. I'd point out a couple of things about this country. One is that Koreans are very influenced by media and by netizen commentary. I'll give you a recent example. When President Yoon declared martial law, even people on his side at the time went, "Hello, what's just happened?" Nobody said, "Oh, at last, what took him so long? Now I feel safe." Well, one or two people might have, but then a short while later, when he was resisting being taken in for questioning, hundreds, if not thousands, of people came out and supported him. So how did that happen? A lot of those people were young and newly politicized. So they got fired up by online media that we probably never heard of, and by online commentary. Of course, this type of thing happens everywhere, but it seems to me that in Korea, people are more rapidly mobilized in this way, and they're more willing to accept what is said by media uncritically. So the point here, the reason I'm making this point is that you and your company, or even you personally, may one day find yourself the subject of a flurry of media attention of this sort. And there's an argument to be made, which we have made with certain types of companies that don't normally deal with media, that when they come to Korea, is at least let themselves be known to the reporters who cover their sector, to create this sort of base of familiarity that preempts any possible misunderstandings later. The second thing I point out, a distinction about Korea, is the astonishing level of influence over government decision-making. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. But it is an argument for companies that don't care about media at home to consider dealing with media while they're here. So now I'm going to ask Sue to give us a broad introduction to the Korean media scene.
Hold on, can I interrupt for a second? It seems that some people are in a test, they've received a test link, and they're in a test version of this Microsoft Teams meeting, and that's why they can't see or hear anything. So I'm receiving some messages from people who are in a test link. They should be joining the OzCham Korea webinar link instead. Yes.
We start again.
Some people on the call or not?
There are some on the right. Can you see there that the OzCham Korea webinar on your list of meetings? There are some people in that, and then there are also some people in the test meeting.
Well, we just record it and we can send it to people as well. So I think we carry on.
So they know to jump over to the...
I'm letting them know now.
Yeah, we can. Sue, would you like to continue on?
Okay, thank you. So let's go to the
the bar in the middle.
Space bar.
Space bar.
okay, yeah. Koreans, as you know, are early adopters of all things new, heavy users of social media, and have become accustomed to living in a high-tech country. Despite this, the media landscape is somewhat traditional in the sense that it is the mainstream established media that is most influential. In Korea, there are about 30 general daily newspapers, 14 business daily newspapers, 3 English daily newspapers, and 3 news agencies. And of course, there are numerous online media outlets, as you know. Despite the advent of various media, the influence of the top 3 general daily newspapers, 조선일보, 중앙일보, and 동아일보, as well as top 2 business daily newspapers, Mail Business newspaper in Korea, Economic Daily, is still very powerful, but not as much as before. As Mike mentioned, the basic reading pattern these days is for people to get their news from Naver, which will post various stories from these media rather than going onto the sites of the individual media. Online media outlets are having rapidly growing influence based on the world's largest number of high-speed internet users in Korea. On the contrary, the newspaper's print circulation has decreased by 1/3 compared to a decade ago. Although the number of online media has increased, It is generally small in size. It's growing fast, but the majority of online media are not making a profit. News consumption through reporter sites such as Naver accounts for more than 75% of the total. And portal sites are functioning as agenda setting functions for the media. Due to the nature of online media, where editing is simple, it is often more inflammatory and controversial. The spread of misinformation is fast as well. Regarding English language Korean media, the Korea Herald, Korea Times, and the Korea Jungang Daily, although the circulation of these media outlets is not large, it serves as an international window for Korea. Terrestrial broadcast media, KBS, NBC, and SBS have weakened monopoly power due to the emergence of comprehensive programming channels such as Channel A, TV Joseon, JTBC, and MBN. Anyway, TV is still the most influential with the public, but TV news tends to be rather sensational to a certain degree. So companies usually don't consider broadcast media as their main target. Trade media outlets provide in-depth information and have expertise in their respective sector or category. Public access is low because it deals with specific fields, and there are many types of paid subscriptions. The dependence on advertising is also high. So the influence of trade media is relatively low in Korea compared to the mainstream media. So back to you, Mike.
Okay. So, um, so we're talking from the point of view of companies and organizations in dealing with the media, and where we meet, where these two forces meet, there's an inherent tension. And this tension is healthy in the sense, it reflects competing professional interests that in theory serve the marketplace. This tension is therefore in the big picture of things as far as decision making by governments and people and consumers and ordinary people, it is a good thing. But the two sides, the business people and the journalists, don't always see it like that. Tension, as anyone who is married can tell you, can make you have negative thoughts about the counterpart that are ultimately not that useful. It's common, for example, for journalists to think there's something unethical about profit seeking. And their frustration trying to get information out of companies may just add to their negativity. Similarly, it's common for business people to see journalists as troublemakers and often unethical troublemakers. The fact that some of them might be shouldn't make it your default prejudice, however. So the professional way of dealing with this tension is for each side to try and understand the other. So what is it we need to understand about reporters? So the reporter's role, and we'll get to Korea in a minute, this applies everywhere. The reporter's role is to gather, assess, create and present news and information that keeps society informed. It's a very important job. And the commodity that journalists trade in is news. So what does this mean exactly? The simplest definition of news is that it's something, an event, a development which interrupts the continuity of life and therefore deserves to be noticed. The great skill of journalists learned over time is to assess whether an event truly meets this definition for their media's audience. It may seem simple, but it's not that easy. You know, if I give an extreme example, if your pet dies, that's news in your family, but it's not going to go on the front page of the Chosen Ilbo. So the reporter who starts to work for the Chosen Ilbo has to learn over time what his editors consider newsworthy. what is important for their readers. This is a skill that tends to get developed over years, in fact. So for reporters, the stories they write must be newsworthy. And secondly, they have to be credible. In other words, the audience has to be able to believe them. So when you're talking with reporters in a professional setting, they're listening to you through these two filters, newsworthiness and credibility. And that requires them, among other things, to resist being pressured and unduly influenced. So journalists differ according to the media they work for. For example, reporters for business media and often experienced reporters in other media who cover business are more likely to understand what you do than other general reporters. Reporters for news agencies, and these news agencies, Sue gave some examples, the main one in this country is Yonhap. Their customers are other media. They tend to write briefer stories and therefore have to write several stories a day and write quickly. So they're different than people who write for weekly magazines, where if you write one article for a weekly magazine, it might be a sort of a catch-all analysis of what's been going on for the week. So in time, the personalities of these two types of reporter get shaped to some extent by the difference in the different jobs. So news agency types are classically impatient if you talk for more than 30 seconds. Regarding national characteristics, the nationality of the publication is more important than the nationality of the individual journalist. We should note, for example, that most foreign correspondents in Korea are actually Koreans. And they approach their job as foreign correspondents differently than a Korean reporter in a Korean media would approach their job. Just to give us sort of a thumbnail, I think it's my experience that American reporters, the way they're trained is they are first accurate, and second, they need to write well to attract readers. For British journalists, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm British, it's the other way around. They're trained to entertain first and be accurate second. And that's why it's more engaging to read British media until they're writing about you, and then you realize actually how bad they are. Now, I'm not sure about Australian reporters. I'll let you judge that, but I suspect they're more British than American. So Sue is going to tell us a little bit about the reporters at work.
Okay, so according to the Korea Press Foundation, about 70% of journalists in Korea are men, but the number of female journalists has more than doubled compared to 2007. The proportion of highly educated journalists from prestigious universities is high. So these reporters are highly educated and quick learners. They're trained to act confidently and assertively. As their job is digging information and reporting on it, we need to be careful as the contents leaked by their sources are often reported. So in general, their job is tough. And reporters are overworked and underpaid. They usually have to write 2 or 3 stories a day, and they get more than 100 emails, text messages, and calls a day. On top of that, as they're very sensitive to scoop and exclusive stories, they also cover unconfirmed speculative articles. Due to these circumstances, they do not place great emphasis on fairness sometimes. If there is a negative story about you, they often won't feel the need to hear your viewpoint, nor do they feel it's necessary to identify where stories come from. A lot of sourcing is just 알려졌다, which means it's been learned. And there's also a habit of copying stories from other media without acknowledgement. These habits are connected to the overwork I mentioned. And the journalists tend to rotate every year or two. They present 2 problems for PR people. One is that we always have to meet new reporters. Second, as soon as they start to get familiar with our sector, they're off covering something else. It is a bit different in the case of trade media, but this is generally the case. So when you deal with the media, just bear in mind that the experience in your respective industry can be limited. And the journalists need to file their stories by 4 or 5 p.m. every day, meaning that they're always in a rush. So if they request some information, it is important to respond to them in a timely manner, unless they're working on long-term projects. Also, it is not a good idea to contact them between 1:30 p.m. and 4 or 5 p.m. As it is a business time for them. And journalists should not be discriminated against or favored according to their media size, type, and importance, because they're human. So if they feel that they're discriminated against for whatever reason, it can be easily be reflected in their stories. Thank you.
So, So picking up on something that I mentioned earlier, Korean media reporters here have influence over political and bureaucratic, particularly, and even business decision makers that, in my opinion, is higher than you might see in other democracies. So let me try and sort of do a portrait of how that manifests. So if those of you here today, if you're in public relations, you'll be familiar with the Korean boss who gets drunk with a reporter and then says things that he shouldn't have, and then the next morning asks you to make sure that what he said doesn't appear in the press. It's much rarer for a foreign executive to get into trouble like this. Why? Because they tend to keep away from reporters. But Korean executives, they're the opposite, because they like to know reporters, or at least they like to be close to one or two. And this is quite puzzling. You might wonder why they take the risk. And the explanation, counterintuitively, may be that Korean executives also tend to be afraid of journalists. When they're asked a question, they often feel as if they must tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, as if the journalist is a prosecutor. And they're not very good at saying no comment. In fact, I've had Korean executives tell me this. I don't know how to not answer a question. So what's going on here? What's the sort of cultural explanation for this? So I see two themes, one of which is particularly true with the older generation, and one that is more recent. In the past here, during the period of development of this country, government was by far the most important stakeholder for companies. It was more important than labor, more important than investors, more important than consumers. And the great skill of the CEOs of the top chaebol, the Chung Ju-yongs of Hyundai, Kim Woo-jung of Daewoo, people like that, their great skill was government relations. So they managed these relationships themselves, while other executives took care of other aspects of the business. And media was influential, even in the days when media was far more subject to control. It was influential over politicians and bureaucrats, in that those government officials and bureaucrats would not support you, the businessman, if you were treated negatively in the press, even if they knew the reports were untrue. Thus, media relations functioned as an arm of government relations and is therefore very important for the CEO. Now, this is no longer the case to the extent I've just described, but the legacy lingers. The second point, which is one I find more difficult to argue, and it is that to do with the concept of democracy in Korea. There are two parts to democracy. There's the democratic part, which is the rule by the people, and then there's is it Republican? I'm not sure. It's the part which is ruled by institutions. So in this country, the idea of democracy is that it's ruled by the people. And this is different from, I would say, Australia, where democracy means more that the people consent to be ruled, but the actual ruling is done by institutions, some of which you elect people for. Thus, in Korea, the voice of the people is very important. The Korean word here is minshim, and minshim refers to public sentiment, which is something deeper, more visceral, more collectively emotional than just public opinion. It's expressed in street protest, in online commentary, and in media. So, excuse me, political and bureaucratic decision makers feel they must obey it. Once this minshim over a certain issue reaches a certain point, decision makers feel they must obey it, and thus negative media coverage of your company in a bad situation can lead to far more serious outcomes than are warranted. Suddenly the tax officials investigating you and the prosecutors are calling. Why? Because it's been driven by online or media negativity that these decision makers feel they have to respond to. Sometimes people think that the media is controlled by government or by political parties. But if you look at these headlines here, if you look at the political and business coverage in the main newspapers, you can see where if there's any control, you can see where it actually lies. Bearing in mind, again, that the unusual event that is newsworthy is not always uplifting. It's normal for media to cover negative developments, accidents, crimes, scandals, and so on. And you'll see this reflected in headlines. In political coverage here today, if you look at the papers today, for example, you'll see a lot of negative headlines. But business coverage, these days, you do get a fair bit of negative, some sort of undermining my own point here. But generally speaking, business coverage tends to be bland or even upbeat. And here are one or two examples from a couple of the English papers on last Friday. You've got exciting developments like Renault Korea expands sales into Latin America, or banks rush to offer services for older people. MOU is signed. These are all sort of either bland, as I say, or super positive. So what's going on here? It is that the media is very influenced here by companies, and particularly the large companies. Media, as we all know, has been in crisis around the world for a generation now over falling ad revenues following everything migrating online. Many media have disappeared. In countries like America, hundreds of media, particularly regional, local media, have disappeared. But in Korea, no major media has closed in this country, as far as I know, since the forced closures and mergers ordered by the military dictatorship in 1980. Not one. Some papers like the Hangul Gilbo have changed ownership, but as far as I think I'm right in saying, none has actually collapsed. And when you consider that the spectrum that they operate in is pretty narrow, that they're all reporting the same things in the same way, this is quite odd. And I think the explanation for this is connected to this phenomenon of public sentiment. With politicians and bureaucrats and even courts bending to some extent to the perceived will of the people, the media, as one of the midwives, as I said, of public sentiment, has huge power. And this situation means that businesses are desperate to be on good terms with media. And being on good terms means it's code for financial support. The chaebol are especially motivated in this way. And that is because of an inherent weakness which in the system which terrifies them. The fact that their founding families are minor shareholders, very, very minor shareholders in these large corporations. But society accepts and sees them as the heads of those corporates and lets them rule. Because we're scared that if their boards of directors were truly answerable all of a sudden to shareholders, it might be dangerous for the economy. Now, this deal that society has with the chaebol, in particular, could change if media started to change its tune regarding corporate governance. And that's why this is what motivates chaebol to support media, which they do in a huge way. If the chairman of Samsung woke up tomorrow and decided to no longer do this for whatever reason, others would follow suit. And I bet you that most major media, 2/3 of the major media probably would collapse within a few months. I think it's that the level of support is that extensive. So how does it work? This funding. In some of the big media, they negotiate rather large arrangements with the chaebol each year. The what we might call the second tier media, they are more engaged in fundraising, which is the responsibility of the advertising department, but they're very much helped by the business desk reporters themselves, who are under tremendous pressure in this regard. And for some of them, this pressure can be quite debilitating and make them sort of lose heart about their profession. It's also, by the way, it's also one of the things I believe that holds women back in journalism, because there's an assumption that women can't do this dirty work so well. As Sue mentioned, now about 70% or 30% of journalists are women, and that's doubled over the last 10 years or so. But actually, in the entry process for major media, where they go through tests and exams and interviews and so on, women tend to always come out on top, but then they're not always the ones being hired. And I think this is one of the factors. Anyway, for this type of engagement with media, the top chaebol have multi-billion won budgets for this. So to give an example, which is, I'll say, is a few years old. So I'm assuming the figures are a bit higher now. There's one industry sector here. I'll beat around the bush on this because I don't really want to identify the company I'm talking about, but one industry sector here has around 500 media that covers it. And that includes a lot of very small online media. And these media used to all write the same story. So from our point of view in PR, this was not such a bad thing. But with so many online media now, as with other sectors, the top business dailies and general dailies covering this sector started to feel competitive pressure to try and differentiate themselves by writing more exclusive stories. And that meant they're not so interested in writing about product launches. because everyone else was. So the companies have to entice them. And this system is subtle in a way that allows those participating in it to avoid feeling that the interaction is corrupt in any way. So this company is a mid-sized player in the sector, makes a payment of 3 million won twice a year to the top 10 media. It also pays between 1 and 2 million won to the top 20 in their list of online media. That's about 30 media altogether. So company A's nearest competitor has a budget that they told me was 2 or 3 times bigger than this. And the biggest player in the sector then would be paying a lot more. So it's important to appreciate that this system continues, not because sales are actually damaged by negative news, but because management is oversensitive to media for the reasons I've given. And one day I think it will end. So what are we to do about this on the other side of media? So Australia has anti-corruption laws, as does the EU and the US, that cover the behavior of its companies overseas. So we need to be very mindful of this. Some foreign companies do, however, participate in this system of providing funds for media, and they're careful to follow the letter of the law, even if they're violating the spirit of the law. But our recommendation as PR consultants, because we're tasked with helping companies manage trust and manage their reputations, is that we should follow the spirit of the law as well as the letter of the law, and only engage with media in this way if the objectives are legitimate. And by that I mean it's perfectly reasonable to donate to a media if you're donating to something that serves your ends, for example, a cultural event that fits with your ESG program, for example. It's important that decisions like that, however, funding decisions, are made strategically, not tactically. In other words, you don't respond to the guy who calls you out of the blue and shakes you down. You have a plan. You can always deal with them by referring to your annual plan. And you also need to know what other people in your sector are doing. Generally, though, we prefer what I might call proper engagement with reporters. And companies that they should cultivate relationships with reporters and relate to their need for news, the reporters' need for news. When Korean reporters know that you're not in the business of donations, they trade with you, so to speak, in terms of the newsworthiness of your news. Another thing that we advise is to act in accordance with company values. If you don't have company values, then you probably want to create some, or at least have your own instinctive values and put them before short-term gain. Stick to Australian law, stick to Korean law. And if you pay for advertorials, make sure they have the paid content disclaimer, which is one of the tricks here. That there are a lot of articles, and you can open up one of the papers and you can see which articles they are, that they're paid for, but they just don't have a disclaimer on them. But you should insist on that disclaimer being there if you're doing that. And I would not be scared into making mistakes. Another bit of advice would be, and I think some of you here will have had this experience where reporters call up and threaten you and so on. And it's very common in Korea for that to happen because it works. There's a tendency here for companies to reward bad behavior. In other words, they give the donation to the person who rings up and threatens them. So you want to do the opposite. Anyone who does that, you blacklist them. And then the others get the message very quickly. and make sure that your PR function has the appropriate authority within the company to provide counsel. In other words, make sure your PR function dealing with this is actually listened to in your company. That's often not the case. Okay, I will end it there. Thank you very much, and take any questions that you might have.
Sent in the chat window, and that is, could you talk about how the press corps system in government ministries works?
We'll talk about that. We don't need to. The press corps system, the Korean, any newspaper, the way a newspaper is structured, as you know, is there will be, and you can see this on the websites, there will be, and you'll see it physically if you visit a newspaper, the way that the desks are organized. You'll get a business desk, desk meaning a section in the office where there's about 10 desks for reporters there. You'll get national, usually means political, courts and so on. You'll get sports, culture and so on and so forth. From a long way back, maybe from the beginning of this country, I'm not sure, the way that those reporters were assigned their duties was prime concern was coverage of government. And so reporters were assigned to ministries. So now you'll get a reporter covering the Blue House, Foreign Ministry, etc., etc. And they would have a little club. There would be an association, and this is changing now. It's changed in recent years because of this sudden plethora of online media, but this club would not allow other reporters to join it. So when the first online media started, they weren't able to join the various ministry press clubs, and the ministry officials who didn't control these press clubs their excuse was, well, we don't control this. I think that has changed, and some ministries moved more rapidly than others in that. The other thing that I think, and I think this has also changed, is that one thing rather odd here that explains sometimes why the coverage is all very similar is that reporters were normally, you would think that if you're a reporter for the Chosen Ilbo, your competitor is the reporter who covers the same ministry for one of the other papers. But actually, the people who journalists were most competitive with were other journalists on their own newspaper. And they tended to see the reporters who cover the same beat as colleagues, and often conspire regarding coverage, So, is there anything else to say about that? I think that's about it. Yeah.
And there's also some reporters who are basically living inside police stations and doing the crime beat, right?
Yeah, and one reason you find that there's so little crime reporting here, or the crime reporting that we see is scandals and big white collar crime. But there's so little crimes about murders and things like that, is not because they don't happen, but it's because cub reporters are assigned to police stations. And being cub reporters, they struggle to get their story. The stories aren't good enough to get in the paper. But that's where they learn the business. This is on the main papers, that is.
Okay, here's another question that says coming. Korea's media scene seems pretty fast-paced and tightly connected to big businesses. So how do you think that smaller players or foreign companies can break through and get noticed by Korean media?
Okay. So I think the your message to the Korean market should align with your business objectives. So I think first thing you need to do is come up with the right PR messages that really aligns with your business objectives and try to figure out, how to send out those messages to the market. And if you're in specific sector or industry, you could think that, okay, so in order to effectively send out our messages and narrative, probably these are the major media outlets that we would like to reach out to. And then once you kind of understand which media outlets would be your target media, then you kind of figure out who's covering that sector, and then try to reach out to those media outlets through those reporters and engage them with a conversation. Send out your news and send out your announcement and try to engage communication with them. I think this PR needs time. I mean, this relationship with media is an investment. You need to invest time and make efforts to engage with them. So I think first thing to do is understand, what kind of messages you want to send out to the market, and which media outlets would be the effective ones to cover those things, and try to figure out which journalists cover that kind of interest, and then go from there.
But that sounds like something that's difficult for a small company or a foreign company to do by themselves. Is this the kind of thing that a good PR firm can help them with?
Yeah, once we start working with our client, we try to understand their PR objectives for the Korean market, and and try to figure out if that really aligns well with their business objectives. And we come up with the key messages and talking points and narrative, and then figure out which should be their target media outlets, and then start having conversation with those journalists and send out our messages. But it's a time-taking process, so it's better to implement this thing for I would say that mid to longer term. Maybe if you just occasionally send out press releases or try to get some interview coverage here and there, it's not gonna add up. You need to do activities that's gonna add up and effectively have some influence on your business. So it's a highly strategic activities, and that's what we're doing with our clients. Yeah.
So if I understand correctly, so simply sending out a press release of what your company is doing, that in itself may not be enough. That may not get the cut through, and that's part of the reason why PR firms like yourself, but also other ones, of course, continually have these relations with Korean news media outlets, right?
Yeah, I think that's true to some extent, but also Sue mentioned earlier that the Korean journalists are overworked. And that's why when we send out a press release, we write them as near to a news story as possible, so that if they've got to write 2 or 3 stories a day and then they get our press release, but it's a load of legalistic gobbledygook, they don't have time to sort of go through it and craft a story from it. If it's written very close to a news story, they might just sort of change 1 or 2 bits and then drop it in, and there it's done. It's only taken them 10 minutes. So I wouldn't be intimidated if you're a small company with large Korean competitors in a sector. I wouldn't be too intimidated. I'd be realistic. You're not going to be able to compete with Chaebol in terms of the responsiveness of media to them. But you can trade with them regarding your story. And Korean media, they tend to have a very strong sense of responsibility regarding the national economy. Unlike, I don't know about Australian reporters, but British reporters wouldn't care to the same extent. Korean reporters do. And when they look at foreign companies, there's an assumption that if you're operating in our market, you're probably better than our people are, our companies are. and what can we learn from you? So they're disposed to learn from you and pay attention to you. So you should take advantage of
Yeah,
that.
Korean journalists are really interested in covering about like innovation, like technological innovation and commitment to the Korean market and the foreign companies' contribution to Korea. So if you have a good story you can share along that line, perhaps there is a good chance to get coverage in the Korean media. And also like these days, there are certain topics and trends that Korean reporters are really interested in covering. So if you can be somewhere in the middle ground, if there is something that you want to talk to the Korean media and understand, what they're really interested in these days, you can come up with some kind of a story angle that can be covered by the media.
I see I've got one more question that's just going, but before I do that, I've got a follow-up question. That there's also a danger on the flip side, and I think you've both seen this over the years, that one story that sometimes pops up in the Korean media is, here's a foreign company coming to Korea with the intention of making money and run.
Oh, yeah.
The mock tweet sort of story, right? And
Yeah.
you've handled crisis communications for companies that have been victims of that kind of story in the past.
No, the idea of making a foreign company making profits in Korea
And sending that profit overseas.
and sending the profits overseas is not a good thing to, even though we're all at it, it's not the thing to be emphasized. Foreign companies can get attacked if they give that impression. So the idea, you'll see the PR at most foreign companies is who are aware of this, emphasizes a commitment to the market. You might think, well, yeah, of course I'm committed to the market. We're here, very committed, but it doesn't occur to you to stress that, but you should stress that because there is this. Because of this concern the reporters have or attention they pay to the interests of the national economy, they're very quick to jump on that. So that's a good point.
Okay, here's our next question. I think we've got time for one more after this. So if anyone's got a question, if you're listening, please type it in now. This is about anti-graft law. I was told that there's an anti-graft law that restricts selective media engagement. In other words, brands need to share the same information or news across the board with all the media. Could you share more if this is still the case today and how companies can navigate that?
Well, I'd say for a complete answer, you want to check with your law firm, get a legal sort of opinion on that. But you're right that there is in the new or relatively new anti-graft law, there is this sort of rather ridiculous idea that you can't be selective, and yet you have to be selective. For example, if you're taking reporters on a fam trip to your HQ or your project in Taiwan, because you've got a similar project here and you want to show them how it looks, you can't sort of hire a jumbo jet and take 500 reporters. You're probably going to take 3 or 4, and so you have to find a way to select them. It's just that you have to make an effort to appear to try and be fair about that. Or have an explanation for why you've chosen the people you have. I think, frankly, I don't know if there have been cases that have come to court around this. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. So it's more, if you're asking the question because reporters have complained to you, that's very different from if you're concerned about your legal standing. If reporters complain to you, you shouldn't worry too much. You basically say, well, we picked one regional paper from Incheon because that's where our project is. We picked one of the main business dailies. We couldn't pick them all, and he was the one who asked. And so you have an explanation for why you've chosen the people you've chosen. Some companies, frankly, they're so scared of being criticized by reporters that they decide not to do anything. I think that's a mistake. I think it should be more bold in dealing with them.
Okay, that takes us exactly to 2:00. We have no last question come in. Any final thoughts from either of you?
Well, I think, one thing about this is, like with everything in Korea, things move at a very rapid pace. But some of these themes that we've talked about today have actually been in place a long time. And media tends to be a rather conservative type of organization, so it moves slowly. But that said, there are huge, there's a plethora now of online media. This is all very new. And one of the things that we've noticed is over the years, now that people read their news largely online through Naver, rather than going to, okay, I'm going to go to the Chosen Ilbo website, then I'm going to go to the Mail Business website and read that. You see what pops up on Naver and you click in. There's a lot less interest in what the actual media is. There's more interest in the story. And this has diluted the influence of media. And you'll know in politics, after the Park Geun-hye impeachment, the conservatives in this country were so disappointed in the media they expected to protect her that they migrated to YouTube. So there's all these kind of things happening. What we've essentially been talking about today, though, is how business is covered. But I would just say that, a couple of years from now, some of the things we've just told you will no longer be applicable. That's how quickly this country moves.
Right, yeah, that's a good final point. Thank you once again to Sue Kim, the Executive Vice President of Insight Communications, and Michael Breen, the founder and CEO of Insight Communications.